more specifically next week about patriotism and freedom. Today we're going to talk a little bit about more about Paul's letter to the congregation in Galatia, because some of the things are very similar that they faced as we face. What Paul's concern to that congregation in Galatia was from beginning to the end, is with every church and every time in history, is his concern for the Christian community, and seeing that most of the time, individual gifts of the Spirit are always going to usher out, they're always going to come out of us in a communal setting of some sort. Okay, we live in modern America, and it's interesting the similarities between Galatia of 52 AD and today, because most of our public religion these days has to do with the individual gifts of the Spirit that you get, which are yours internally so that you know that you're saved. What is very less prominent and very little spoken about in most cases is the fact that what are you going to do with the gifts once you got them? What are you going to do once you're saved? And that's the thing that Paul picks up on today in this reading. He talks about the fruits of the Spirit, and they're engendering not just the individual feeling good about God loving you, but also then the responsibilities and the gifts that you've been given to pass on to the people around you. You'll note in one part of the second lesson from Galatians, Paul says that first the animal bites the prey, then it tears at the flesh of the victim, then finally it consumes its prey. Paul is talking about manipulation. Because if you sense ever that you're being manipulated, chances are that somebody is biting you, just nipping at you to try to get you to do what they want. And then after a little while, if you give in to it, then they start to take a pound of flesh here and there. And you're feeling really bad, but you're not exactly sure why you're feeling bad. You know something's not quite right. And then finally, those who manipulate you will devour you and consume you. You may not physically die, but if you ever have weeks and months and years on end where life just stinks and you just, what's going on here? It could well be that you're just being manipulated, if not by individuals, then certainly by the mass media, by our politicos in Washington, D.C., which is a whole different place. Any of us who were parents, we faced that conversation at some point, let's face it. Dad, Mom, I'm an adult now, and it's time for you to back off. Now, I don't know when that conversation will come. Usually starts nowadays around age 14, I believe, when you want to stay out till midnight at the mall. But the conversation is always about the nature of manipulation. When the parents back off so that we're not taking a chunk of our kids' flesh and then beginning to devour them so that we live our lives through them. Any of you who have kids in athletics or dance or something like that, and you go nutsy, crazy bananas on the sidelines, knock it off now. It ain't about you. Not at all. Not about you. It's about the kids and their skills and enjoyments and pleasure in the game. The animal bites, tears, and then consumes. And so we're all familiar with how that works and how we participate in it as consumers from time to time, and how we've also been consumed and had to learn how to say no, not doing that. The ethical life that Paul talks about is very simple, that spiritual people march to a different drummer. And I don't know if you noticed, and if you haven't, you should look at the second lesson today on your own. He's going to be talking about living in the Spirit in terms of its movement, walking in the Spirit, being led by the Spirit, living by the Spirit, and keeping in step with the Spirit. So each and every time Paul is talking about the gift of the Spirit of God, he's always talking about it in terms of some movement. The question becomes, where are you heading with your movement? And that's why then he goes into the difference between the gifts of the lower natures that he lists so prolifically, and then the gifts of the higher natures. So that you're walking, and the question becomes, what are you carrying with you when you're walking, and what's your destination? His sense is that all of the gifts of the Spirit are movement, and that the movement that you carry with you are movements to a higher calling, to a bettering of life for your neighbors, whoever they may be, and in whatever sense you find them. Sharon Park says, faith is the dynamic composing of meaning. And for Paul, as he understands that, you're always in a dynamic movement of meaning with your life. That is, there are times and places where you ought to just stop yourself short, bang. And if not, it'll happen anyway, whether you like it or not. Where you have to evaluate and think about your past, what it has meant, what the present looks like, and therefore, what do you project into the future? That's a lot more fuzzy, that future thing. You know that as well as I do. But in any case, it is that movement of faith where we need to make sense of things that Paul is talking about, and says that what God does is equip us with good gifts so that we can make sense of things as we're moving towards our neighbors in our different communities. Very interesting. I'll pull you something out from history here. Post-World War II, those of you, and there are not many of you, those of you who had your primary working years post-World War II and into the early 1970s, got it? Into the early 1970s. We're building a world different and better. Progress was for the sake of making the world a better place for everybody. Even in the Soviet Union and the arms race, even the folks there, the leadership, recognized that the world had to become a better place. And so mutually assured destruction in a sick kind of way made for a peace in which people could grow and mature and progress in their lives. Every culture espoused progress and making the world a better place for the next generations. And that is how many of us grew up. Some few of you actually worked in that environment for 25 years. Interesting thing. The majority of economic progress in those years philosophically was wrapped around, and I can guarantee you that you have not heard this since 1973, the virtuous circle of growth. It's an economic philosophy, and it lasted for about 25 years. And that's when Christians were really, really predominant and pushy in the society on social affairs and social issues that encompass the entire culture and society. And what that involved, Frank Abrams of Standard Oil at the time said this about it. The job of management is to maintain an equitable and working balance among the claims of directly affected interest groups, stockholders, employees, customers, and the public at large. That was the virtuous circle of growth. And that was the economic philosophy for about 25 years in our country when we really maximized our progress and everybody was working. It then included people who there was a recognition were going to fall by the wayside, people who just couldn't either keep up educationally, people who couldn't keep up physically. The virtuous circle of growth included the whole culture. It was during those years that we had the voting rights increased so that people couldn't be cut out of the elections. Civil rights movement, caring for the least of these. There were a lot of things that went on in those years because that was the philosophy, the virtuous circle of growth. And that was the impact of Christian believers on the culture in those days. And that's the point that Paul is making to the congregation in Galatia in 52 AD and would make on us today, is that we live always in a movement of walking. The question becomes, what do we carry with us in our walk? And what is our destination? For Paul, the destination was always coherent and good communities of people. People who would watch after each other, people who would care for each other, people who would try to build lives, always, and do that by any means possible, economics, political, social, cultural, the whole shooting match. That is the gift that you and I have been given, the gift of communities of faith. And it's very rare that you're going to hear any of this kind of conversation. I know that. You just won't. And that's why Paul considered congregations so important to the development of the faith of all of us, because we get to have conversation about the nature of the walk in the Spirit that we're going to make. You see, it's really clear that when you think about it, we're only one kind of person, really, in terms of our movements. We are either healthy, mature, upbuilding people who want to see the best for our neighbors and will be oriented that way, as was true in that 25-year post-war period, or we will become like mad dogs, tearing a little bit of flesh every now and again. And then as the person is bandaging that, we'll take another chunk out from somewhere else. And pretty soon we'll devour the whole person. The metaphor for a way of living, which is not healthy or upbuilding. But that's the kind of discussion and description that Paul gave to the congregations in Galatia and to us. What kind of people are we? We've been well equipped and well graced with good gifts that will help to build life, that will help to instill a sense of hopefulness about the future and about our lives. Or we can work on our lower natures. And unfortunately, between media and politics, we're heading into our lower natures. And it's becoming destructive and hurtful in every way you can possibly imagine. Your call and mine is to try to redo that and reshape that so the conversations are more upbuilding and more hopeful, and that the movement that we carry is more descriptive of what Paul says. To live by the Spirit is to be guided by the Spirit. It is to talk about such things as patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness. See, faithfulness is not always toward God. Faithfulness is also to our fellow citizens. There is a covenant of faithfulness which obliges all of us to do well as citizens and to include people in that gift and in that movement of progress. It's your gift of the Spirit and mine. And it calls for training and discipline. I was talking to somebody 3 weeks ago, I have to tell you, they saw a car accident on the side of the road, one car accident. And they were going to stop, but they didn't, because they had just heard a news report about people faking car accidents, and you stop and help them at night, and then they knock you on the head and steal your money and maybe your car. So they didn't stop. And they felt terrible about it. But they called the police and that kind of thing and don't know what the resolution was. Interesting, they said, 30 years ago, we would have stopped. Now, we were afraid to stop, so we didn't. There are differences in our culture, and it's getting more mean-spirited. And it is our particular gift and our particular callings to undo that meanness and to replace it with the kind of goodnesses and kindnesses and mercy and wise as a serpent and gentle as a dove as Jesus says, of disciples. That's what we bring to our culture.